In the early 90s, way back before I got married and had kids or pulled my head out of my butt and generally got my life together, I had this girlfriend. I was madly in love with her, though, and I thought she was perfect and believed that we'd spend the rest of our lives together. And then one day, I found her in bed with a coworker after coming home from work early. And so I grabbed a bag, packed everything I couldn't afford to lose, and then walked her out. About an hour later, I'm pulling into a motel about 15 miles out of town. It wasn't the first one I saw, but it was the first that seemed like I wouldn't wake up to find my car stolen. So I pulled in, booked a room for a week, and then asked the clerk where the nearest liquor store was. I got blasted that first night, and then woke up so hungover that I poured the rest of that second bottle of vodka down the bathroom sink. It was clear alcohol wasn't going to fix anything, and so after loading up on beef and cheese at a nearby burger place, I headed back to my motel room and went to sleep. Maybe 3 hours later, I woke up at around 9:30 at night and then dragged myself into the shower to rinse away the cobwebs. I figured that I was in for a chill evening of TV and maybe a pizza delivery if the clerk on the front desk knew of one that'd drive out that far. But I walked back into the bedroom to the sound of someone yelling in the parking lot outside. I peeked out of the curtains after I toweled off and threw on some clothes and saw a woman standing at the far end of the parking lot having some kind of public freakout. She was yelling at the clerk from the front desk, but from that distance and being behind the window, I couldn't make out what she was saying. I guess seeing someone else having a hard time made me feel a little bit better about my own. At least, that's what I blame for the curiosity getting the better of me. And then within a few seconds of seeing her, I was outside on the walkway, smoking a cigarette and pretending not to watch the drama unfold. But the second I heard what she was talking about, I didn't find it nearly as entertaining as I thought I would. I guess that probably makes me sound like some kind of a-hole, but who doesn't enjoy a harmless little confrontation between two pissed-off strangers? The woman looked like she was in her late 20s or early 30s. Black hair, tan, wearing jeans, sneakers, and a white t-shirt, and in between yelling for the clerk to shut up and listen to her, she kept saying crazy stuff like, "We need to get everyone out, and they're all gonna die." I remember thinking, wait, what? And taking a few steps towards the parking lot so I could hear what they were saying better. The clerk was trying to calm her down, saying that he'd call the cops, but the woman didn't want to hear it. She kept telling the guy, "Cops won't be able to do crap. They'd end up dead too. You need to get everyone out of here right now." I wasn't the only person to overhear all of this, and as the yelling continued, more and more people started coming out of their rooms to see what all the commotion was for. A few kids came out with their parents, but quickly got ushered back inside when they heard the lady screaming about her imminent mass murder. It was so convincing that I was like, is this girl having a mental breakdown here in the parking lot of a motel, or is this legit? Like, are people really coming to kill us? It seems like a hell of a thing to take a gamble on, I thought. And people on the second floor were obviously thinking the same thing because, while some people were going back into their rooms looking very worried, one guy came out again with his car keys in hand, obviously getting ready to book it should anything actually go down. The woman screaming sure as hell sounded like she believed what she was saying. She was scared, and that fear was infectious. People were starting to get anxious, kids were crying, and all the while she's getting more and more agitated while yelling at the crowd of onlookers saying, "Don't you get it? We can't stay here!" Hell, I felt it myself. That creeping thought of, well damn, what if she's right? Other people were obviously thinking the same thing, and not just the guy who grabbed his car keys either. People were yelling, "Just call the cops, man." Things like that, but you could tell it wasn't so much that this woman was freaking out, it was because they were actually scared of the stuff she was saying. The clerk turned to the crowd on the second floor balcony, which is where the yell of "call the cops" had come from. He started saying something back about how the situation is under control, and then I think he was about to tell people to go back into their rooms when the woman seemed to lose her mind completely for a second. I guess it was the guy claiming that everything was under control, because as soon as those words came out of his mouth, she started pacing towards him, and he didn't see how close she was until it was too late. He tried to back away from her, telling her to keep away, but she managed to grab him by the arm. I figured that she was about to start trying to hit him or something, but instead, she kind of dragged his forearm towards her while she leaned forward, and then sunk her teeth into the guy's forearm so hard that I actually think she was drawing blood. The clerk started screaming for his life, "Get the hell off of me," before letting out a loud screech of pain as the woman bit him. I remember the gasps and cries coming from around the motel as she bit the dude, and this prompted another handful of people to retreat to their rooms like they didn't want to be around for whatever happened next. I'm not sure how the clerk got her off of him, but I guess he dragged her off by the hair or something and shoved her, because the next thing I knew, she was picking herself up off the ground while the clerk ran back towards the front desk holding his arm. As the woman kept yelling about how we were all going to die, someone walked out from the front desk with a gun in his hand saying the cops had been called, and she was saying to leave right now before they showed up and arrested her. Once again, the lady freaked out and started screaming at the top of her lungs about how the cops couldn't help anyone and they'd only die too. She then started marching towards the person I'd later discovered was the motel's manager, but he didn't make the same mistake as his employee. He backed up, keeping a distance between them as he raised that gun and told her to back off. Now looking back on it, that's when I started to think that she wasn't crazy, at least not entirely crazy, because the sight of that gun being pointed at her stopped her dead in her tracks. She kept on backing up from the manager with his gun pointed, and then she turned around and saw a couple of young parents watching from the second-floor balcony with the girl holding their baby. The crazy lady ran for the stairs, begging them to hand over their baby so at least it'd be spared from what was coming. She didn't even make it halfway up before the dad cut her off. He tried blocking her at first, but when she swung for him, he shoved her back so hard that she tumbled down the last couple of stairs. It wasn't some bad fall, so she got right back up again, but just as she was making her way up the stairs towards the young father again, the cops suddenly rolled into the parking lot and caught her attention. Their patrol car turned into the parking lot with a quick wail of its siren, as if to say, "All right, break it up." The manager with the gun placed it on the ground and raised his hands into the air. One of the cops jumped out and pulled his own gun, but didn't point it as the manager started explaining the situation. That same cop started walking towards him so he could secure the gun, and then told the guy to head back inside until the situation was resolved. But the other cop, he started walking towards the lady who'd been screaming, and the whole thing started over again. At first, the lady acted kind of relieved, like the cops were going to help her evacuate the motel. But as soon as that one cop made it clear that wasn't going to happen, she started screaming about how they're all going to die again. Only that time, she went from maybe a 5 out of 10 on the crazy scale to a full-on 11. She started saying, "Why is no one listening to me? Are you effing stupid or something?" And she's not just yelling or screaming this time. She's screeching and wailing so loud her voice was starting to break up, and some of the words are kind of getting mushed together in her rush to get them out. I think this was one of the most disturbing aspects of the whole thing, seeing the last of this woman's mind starting to slip away from her right there in front of me. She started walking towards the cop in front of her. He backed off and pulled out this bright yellow pistol taser, and although he didn't point it right away, just seeing him take it out sent her completely over the edge again. She rushed forward, I'm guessing to try and bite that cop, and he didn't hesitate. He pointed his taser, fired it, and the woman's body just sort of locked up mid-run before she hit the ground face first. It was a nasty fall, man. A really nasty fall. And then, when the cops went to put the cuffs on her, it looked like she was out cold. Not long after the ambulance showed up, and after wrapping the woman's face up with some bandages, the paramedics hauled her onto a stretcher and then drove to what I'm guessing was the hospital, with the cops following close behind. The motel's manager walked around the parking lot, basically begging people to not check out and assuring them everything was back under control. I went back into my room, grabbed my keys, and then went back to the burger joint for some fries and a milkshake. No one showed up at the motel and slaughtered everyone, but by then I figured that wasn't going to happen. The poor woman just, I guess, lost her mind somehow and was convinced something terrible was about to happen. The thing is, something bad was about to happen, just only for her. My name's Jan. I'm a grandma from the Midwest, and many years ago now, my husband Bill and I drove our 2 kids all the way over to Vineland, New Jersey to spend some time with family. It made for a long trip. So long, in fact, that we decided it was better to spend the night in a motel rather than arrive at Bill's parents' place at 2 in the morning. We picked one of the more expensive options in the hopes that we'd avoid anything sketchy or seedy, and when we arrived, it was every bit as nice as we had actually hoped. The staff was friendly, it was clean and well managed, and our room was spacious and comfortable with a pretty nice bathroom too. We checked in, hauled our suitcases from the trunk, and then went for a very nice dinner at a nearby bar and grill before returning to the room at around 9:30. We watched some TV together, then once the kids were just about ready for bed, my husband went into the bathroom to brush his teeth while I coaxed our son and daughter under their covers. Since I'd promised our daughter a bedtime story that night, I was obliged to read one. But since our slightly older son was within earshot, he insisted that I tell a story about cattle-driving cowboys repelling Indian attacks, and not one about princes and princesses finding romance and getting married. And yet, while the 3 of us negotiated some middle ground, there was a sudden and unexpected knock at the door. It was almost 10 p.m., and the unspoken arrangement in our house was that if anyone had knocked that late, it was my husband that would answer the door. So as soon as he heard the knocking, he spat and wiped his mouth and then made his way towards the door with a very irritable look. When our son asked him, "Who is it?" he told him it was probably just one of the motel workers. But when my husband opened the door, it was not a member of the motel staff. Standing outside our motel room were 4 men. The 3 younger-looking guys wore sweatsuits and were very tanned and muscular, almost like bodybuilders, while the one older man was frail and pale, but a much sharper dresser. And the older man apologized for bothering us so late, and then explained that he and his nephews would like to come inside and talk to us about something. My husband mirrored the man's approach and very politely explained that it wasn't a good time. We had a long drive ahead of us in the morning and we were about to head to bed. And then this man countered that he really must insist, and assured my husband after a short conversation that he'd be out of our hair. My husband remained well-mannered, but made it clear that we didn't want any company, especially at such a late hour, with folks that we didn't even know. And the older man didn't say anything in response, he just sort of turned and nodded towards one of his nephews. One of them then reached around his back. When he brought his hand back around, I saw that he was holding a gun. Then, as the nephew held the black handgun discreetly against his thigh, the older man explained that unfortunately on this occasion, he wasn't asking, he was telling. Our son, our eldest kid, was smart enough to realize that something was wrong, maybe from the look on his face or possibly from my husband's prolonged silence after the nephew produced the gun. In a whisper, my son asked me who was at the door, and I told him I didn't know, but that he needed to take his sister into the bathroom and climb into the tub together. When he asked why, I gave him an excuse that I'd used before during a far less frightening incident. And since he couldn't see past the open doorway and he hadn't seen the gun, I was able to tell him that we needed to talk about some grown-up stuff with the nice men outside. It wouldn't be for long, but he and his sister weren't allowed to listen to the grown-up talk. They had to go wait in the bathroom for a couple of minutes. When he asked if he could take a pillow, I said yes, and then he took his little sister by the hand and led her into the bathroom before shutting the door. But just as he did, I looked around to see my husband backing up with his hands raised while the men entered the room. After one of the younger men closed the door behind him, the older man invited us to take a seat on the double beds so we could get comfortable. and then after sitting in the same chair that I'd just occupied a few moments before, he took out a cigarette which was lit by one of his nephews. After taking a drag, he took a look around the room and then asked us, "Pretty nice place, huh?" And in response, my husband's voice trembled with anger and fright as he asked, "What do you want?" The older man sort of tutted and shook his head, and then after another long drag of his cigarette, he told my husband, "Doesn't have to be like this," and that he could relax. He explained that we were going to come to a compromise, and when we did, he and his nephews would leave without so much as raising their voices. My husband's tone didn't change at all. He just repeated his question, and then the old man began to explain what he wanted. He said that he and the two men with him had stayed in the room just the night before, and that unfortunately, he'd become forgetful in his old age. He'd left something in that room, something he knew the motel staff wouldn't be stupid enough to steal, and since we were the next family to occupy it, it must have been us that had found whatever he'd left behind. It was then that I finally spoke up, saying that we hadn't found anything of value in the room and that it'd be a lot easier to help him if we knew what the missing item was. While the faces of the younger men stayed cold as ice, the older man smiled at me and explained what he'd left behind should be in the nightstand closest to me. As I stood up to go check, the older man had to stop the nephew with the gun from pointing it at me. I was shaken, but indignant, so instead of shrinking back down onto the bed, I kept course towards the nightstand. When I opened it, I found it empty. I turned, inviting one of the younger men to come and check it for himself so he could confirm that it was empty. No one moved. Then, with a chuckle, the older man explained how he figured that'd be the case. He then went on to explain that if the nightstand was empty, then the explanation was simple. One of us had taken his property, and if we wanted to live, we'd return it. It was my turn to get angry, because I figured that I'd worked out the guy's scam. He accused people of stealing his property and then intimidated them until they handed over the cash value, but when I confronted him on that, he laughed again. He wasn't trying to scam anyone. All he wanted was his property back. And my husband jumped in asking what property. In response, the older man ordered us to tell our kids to come out of the bathroom. We refused at first, but then he said we could ask them to come out quietly, or one of his nephews could kick the door in and then drag them both out by the hair. He said it was our choice, so we made one, and it was me who tried to sound as calm as possible as I asked them both to come out of the bathroom. There was a pause, and everyone went quiet as the bathroom door slowly opened. Then our son led our daughter out into the bedroom by the hand. Both of them looked nervous, not terrified or on the verge of tears, just very, very anxious. The older man took on the air of a very friendly uncle, telling the kids not to be scared and that he and his goons, I'll call them what they were, I guess, were friends of the family. That didn't do much for them, but I guess it was better than threats. He then asked, very simply and plainly, if the kids had found anything while playing in the room. When both kids shook their heads, he asked if they were sure. Both silently nodded, their eyes very wide and frightened as they did. He asked them a few more times, saying things like, "You wouldn't lie to me now, would you, kids?" But their answers didn't change. Neither had found anything. The older man turned back to us with a not-so-friendly look on his face, and then asked if we understood what a difficult position we were putting him in. I was terrified, but the hypocritical question made me seethe with anger, and I snapped at him. Now, admittedly, this was very unwise, but when I said it was difficult to sympathize with him, seeing as he was putting us in one of the most difficult situations in our entire lives. And then, the older man stopped smiling altogether, and then after stamping out his cigarette in an ashtray that was on the coffee table next to him, he leaned forward in his chair and asked me something I will never, ever forget, not as long as I live. He asked me, Is my nephew going to have to really hurt you in front of your children?" The question, or the implication at least, made my jaw drop and stunned my husband into silence. The older man deliberately confused our silence for incomprehension and slowly repeated the question. And when he did, our little girl's eyes began to well up with tears and she started begging the older man, "Please don't shoot them." The man explained in that same talking to his kid voice that he didn't want to, but that Mommy and Daddy had taken something from him. Our son stayed quiet, hugging his sister closer as she started to cry. The older man turned his back to us, and for the first time, he looked truly angry as he told us, "Look what you did. Now you got your daughter crying." And then in a voice that set every nerve on edge, he told us he didn't want to strangle her to keep her quiet, but he would if he needed to. And the suggestion caused my husband's rage to boil over. He didn't get up, but he just sort of seethed there with anger as he told the man, "You touch a single hair on her goddamned head." But he didn't get past head before the goon with the gun suddenly pointed it at him. The older man told us to keep calm, that he didn't want either of us upsetting our daughter more than she already was. I looked at her, burying her face in her brother's pajama shirt, and it was then that I saw that not only was one of my son's hands free, but he was fishing for something in the pocket of his pajama pants. Within seconds, everyone was seeing the same thing, and we watched in silence as my son pulled something from his pocket. It was a ring, a gold one, and it seemed to have what looked like a huge ruby surrounded by diamonds. And after taking it from his pocket, he held it up as if to say, "Here it is." And my husband and I were far too relieved to be mad at first. I remember Bill's head sort of sinking into his hands, covering his face, almost saying, "Oh, thank God." And I was still too stunned to say anything. I just watched as the older man smiled this big, wolfish smile, before laughing like the whole thing was just some big joke. And I remember how he turned to his goons and said something like, "Even after all these years, I still got it." He then gestured towards my son and told him to return the ring. Seeing my son gently push his sister to one side and walk towards the older man brought back this very deep, primal, motherly terror that my babies were about to get hurt. And when I whispered, "Please don't hurt them," the old man hushed me in that friendly uncle kind of way, and then held out his hand for my son to place the ring onto. After he did, he tried to run back to his sister, but the older man snatched him by the wrist and jerked him around so he was facing him. My son silently locked up in terror. My husband managed to say, "Please don't." But I mirrored my boy. I was frozen to the spot, praying the man would keep his word now his ring had been returned. He told my son he wasn't going to hurt him, and then said it wasn't that he stole something that was wrong. It's that he stole it from the wrong person. My son stayed silent, staring up at him with those wide, terrified eyes. And the older man laughed again. He leaned forward, gave my son a gentle slap on the cheek, and said, "He's got balls, this kid. Reminds me of a younger version of myself." After he let go of my son's wrist, the older man told him to quiet down his sister, who by then was crying very loudly. The older man then got up and said a bunch of stuff about there being no hard feelings, how it was all water under the bridge, and he was sorry for the intrusion. But for me and my husband, we were barely listening. We'd each rushed over to the kids as soon as those goons stepped out of the way, comforting them as the men exited the room. The last thing the man said as he walked out was, "Pretend we were never here." Then as quickly as they'd arrived, they were gone. And as you can imagine, the kids were completely distraught, especially my son. He was still 6 years old at the time, so still very much in that sticky-fingered, prone-to-swiping things phase. But after I sent him into the bathroom, He didn't realize what was going on when he came out again, and he didn't want to speak up about finding the ring in case it got us into even more trouble. I obviously made it clear that it was wrong to have kept the ring and not mentioned it to anyone, but I also made it clear that those were very bad men, very, very bad men, and that they would have been mean to Mommy and Daddy no matter what happened. I didn't want to upset him any more than he was, so it wasn't until afterwards that I gave him a much harsher talking to about the consequences of stealing things. But at the end of the day, the whole thing was just a terrible case of bad luck. After going through something so frightening in that motel room, the kids refused to sleep in it. We managed to talk them into sleeping in the car, at which point it made sense to just get back on the road again. My husband and I were hopped up on adrenaline too, and while we didn't mind staying in the room as such, there was no way either of us were getting any real sleep if we stayed. We made the drive to Bill's parents, and as much as we apologized for waking them at almost 4:30 in the morning, they completely understood once we told them what had happened. And what happened was probably the single most terrifying thing to ever happen to me in my life. One of the few times in life where I thought that I was about to watch one of my own children be harmed. And as a mother, I wouldn't wish that same feeling on my worst enemy. It was the kind of terror that I can barely describe, and a kind that I'm thankful that I haven't experienced in the many years since. Back when I was still in college, I used to drive home for the holidays, and since my parents lived all the way across the country, the journey took a day and a half and included an overnight stop in a motel. It was one of those single-story L-shaped places that looked like it had been around since the 50s or something, where the rooms opened directly onto the parking lot. The paint was fading. It had 2 buzzing neon signs out front that you could hear at night. And since the place was clean and cheap and was mostly exactly a 10-hour drive from college, I figured it was as good a place as any to get some needed sleep. Now, during my sophomore year, I pulled in and paid cash for a room and then parked right in front of my door. I dumped my overnight bag inside, checked the room over to make sure everything was as it should be, and then walked back outside to my car. But as I was locking my door, someone came up to the room next to mine. It was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, and since she was looking down at her phone as she walked past, she slammed into me as she did so. I was about to mumble sorry out of reflex, but she beat me to speaking. Not to offer an apology of her own, but to call me a dumb effing B-word who should watch where she's standing. It was so insane that I was stunned, and I didn't let it bother me. And as I walked to my car, I kind of laughed to myself at how comically terrible some people can be. I also remember being super relieved that I was only staying one night and that I most likely wouldn't have to interact with her again. I had no idea that me and Little Miss Rude were in for a much more significant encounter. I drove down to the same fried chicken place that I stopped by during my freshman year and was relieved to find that it was still open. I got myself a sandwich, some fries, and an iced tea, and then, after back out into the parking lot, I spotted a man standing by what I assumed was his car. It looked like he was watching the people inside through the big panel windows. The second he saw me, he called out in a friendly voice, asking if I could help him. Then when I asked what was going on, he told me his story. So about a week prior, his wife's parents had died in a freak car accident. She was absolutely devastated, but as the days went by, she got worse and worse, until one day, when she seemed to have a complete nervous breakdown and drove off in her car after saying she was going to find her dead parents, like she didn't really believe they were gone. Given what a fragile state of mind his wife was in, the man said he was desperate to find her before she got herself hurt or into trouble. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone to show me a picture of her, and when he turned the screen around so I could see, I recognized who it was. It was Little Miss Rude, the lady who barged into me outside my motel room maybe only 45 minutes prior. I took a long look at the picture, staying quiet while I studied it, and then after looking up to meet the man's eyes, I told him, "Nope, sorry, haven't seen her. but if you give me your cell number, I can call you if I do." And I tried to sound as genuine as possible, took down his cell number before wishing him luck, and then walked back to our cars as he thanked me for my kindness. Now, a lot of you are going to ask, why the hell did you just lie to that nice man searching for his wife? And I get it. I'd be asking the same thing if it was me reading this right now. But right as I was on the cusp of telling the guy, "Good news, I know where she is. She's in the hotel room right next to mine," I heard my friend Allie's voice in my head. Allie, who'd been one of my best friends all throughout high school, had suffered through a horrible dating experience back when she was a senior. She ended up dating an older guy, not by much, just a couple of years. But while this guy seemed cool and had a nice car and had money to spend on her, he turned out to be an absolute psycho who could not take no for an answer. She had to quit her job and find one someplace else because he kept showing up trying to either yell at her or beg her to take him back. But just a few months into working at the new place, he showed up there too, and this time, he didn't want to talk. He tried dragging her into his car. The cops were called, it was a whole thing, but then afterwards, when one of her old middle school friends heard about it, she called her in tears saying the whole thing was her fault. The ex-boyfriend had reached out to her, told her a bunch of lies about organizing a surprise party, and then managed to trick her into spilling the beans regarding Allie's new place of work. It was cruel, devious, and manipulative, illustrating exactly why she'd had to break up with him in the first place. So when that guy showed me a picture of his wife, after telling me a bunch of stuff I had no way to verify, I figured that I'd better play it safe. It wasn't just Allie's experience that made me lie to him either. There was something about the way he told his story that just didn't sit right with me. It sounded almost rehearsed, and while I'd obviously help the guy out if his story turned out to be true, it's always better to be safe than sorry. When I got back to the motel, I went straight to the door of the room next to mine and then hesitated a few moments before finally knocking. I saw the curtains twitch to the right of me and then suddenly heard little Miss Rude yell, "What do you want?" She didn't sound mad or crazy, just a little annoyed that I'd knocked on her door, sure, but nothing like the nervous breakdown her husband had described. When I told her I had something to ask her, and it was better to ask face to face, she came to the door and opened it just a crack before peering out at me from the dark inside. She then asked me again in a much lower voice what business I had knocking at her door. Now, I didn't quite know what to say at first, or rather, I didn't quite know how to say it. So instead, I just asked her a question in the form of, "Ma'am, did your parents pass recently?" Now, she just screwed up her face before telling me no. Her father had died many years before, and her mother was still very much alive. It feels tasteless to say this given the circumstances, but that vindication, that confirmation that I was right to withhold information, it felt great. I hadn't been paranoid, and my suspicions had been entirely correct. And the lady still had a confused look on her face, so I quickly told her about the man that I met in the parking lot of that chicken place and how he'd showed me a photograph of her. And the second I said it, her face just dropped and turned white. But not just in shock or realization, she looked more like I'd told her the dead were rising from their graves. She looked terrified, and after a few moments of silence, she told me, "Can you come inside?" And after she shut the door behind us, the first thing she did was thank me, and I witnessed a total shift in this woman's demeanor. She went from rude and antisocial to sweet and vulnerable as she explained that she'd recently escaped from her abusive husband. It wasn't just arguments or bad tempers, but years of steadily escalating violence. Then, by the time she got scared he might beat her to death, she knew it was time to go, and she slipped away while he was at work with nothing but a case of clothes, some cash, and her car. Hearing about all the abuse she went through made my skin crawl, and when I told her I'd lied to him about not seeing her, she looked so relieved that I thought she might cry. I also told her about taking his cell number and joked about how I could misdirect him with a false sighting. Now, this was the first time I actually saw her smile, and she laughed weakly before warning me not to get involved. Then, after thanking me a dozen more times, I went back to my room and got ready for bed. I went to sleep feeling good, like I'd done something truly special in helping a battered spouse avoid her abusive husband. But a couple of hours later, I hear this crash that had me bolting out of bed, terrified. And because in that moment I had major sleepy brain, I initially thought that what I'd heard was a car accident on the highway outside, but I didn't even make it over to the window before I heard another bang. And it was coming from the room next door, the one with Little Miss Rude, or as she should really be called, the wife on the run. I dialed 911 on speaker as I threw on some clothes, telling them what was going on before heading out the door into the parking lot. I hadn't seen the husband yet, but I didn't need to. I knew only one man in the world could be responsible for the things she'd screamed, and the only one who would have replied in the way he did. Once I was dressed, I ran out into the parking lot just in time to see the same man from the chicken place parking lot. He had her by the arm, and he was dragging his escaped wife toward a pickup truck. He was dragging her, but she wasn't on her feet. She was unconscious, her legs scraping against the gravel, and the sight of her ragdoll like that made me feel sick. I started yelling and screaming for him to let her go, for people to help her, and before long, a couple of other motel guests came out of their rooms. One of them, a big guy in flannel pajama pants, ran straight toward them and shouted for him to let go. Another man from further down the road joined in. The husband swung at one of them, but in the chaos, a third man came at him from the side and shoved him so hard he let go of his wife. After that, he seemed to realize just how outnumbered he was, and after running to his truck, he peeled out of that lot and zoomed off down the highway. Someone had already called the police, and another guest was on the phone with 911 for an ambulance, and the woman just laid on the floor, still out cold with her face all swollen on one side. I started wondering how her husband could have found her, and when it hit me, the realization made me feel twice as nauseous. He must have seen that I recognized her when he showed me that photo of her, or maybe he just smelled the lie for what it was. Then all he had to do was follow me back to the motel at a distance, and then he could have watched from afar as I knocked on that door of her room. I made it easy for him. I thought that I'd been helping her, and instead, I'd condemned her to face a nightmare come to life. The cops arrived to secure the area, and then not long after, the EMT showed up and wheeled her away on a stretcher. She was awake by then, but she obviously wasn't doing too well, and I couldn't bring myself to try and talk to her because of how guilty I felt. I was convinced that I'd led her abusive husband straight to her, and I'm still convinced that that's the case, even after years upon years of trying to convince myself otherwise. After the cops and EMTs drove off, the whole lot went completely quiet again, and I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but it didn't come easy. In the morning, I packed my bag and checked out, barely making eye contact with the manager as I did so. I didn't ask about the woman, and I couldn't bring myself to. I just sort of got in my car and drove off. I've been cleaning rooms at the Cedar Pines Motel for almost 15 years now. It's not a fancy place, just one of those long, single-story motels you see off the highway, the kind with faded green doors and an ice machine that only seems to work when it wants to. We get a mix of guests. Some are just passing through, some stay for a couple of weeks, and you learn very quickly not to ask too many questions. Now, it was a quiet afternoon in late September, I remember, and I was coming back from cleaning room 8 when I saw a kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, walking back and forth outside room 14. Now, at first, I thought he was just playing, maybe waiting for his parents to come back from the vending machine. But after a while, I noticed that he wasn't playing so much as just sort of pacing up and down. And when I asked him where his mom and dad were, he just sort of shrugged and said he didn't know. I didn't look scared exactly, more like empty. Like whatever had happened had knocked all the pep out of him or something. And after taking the kid's hand, I went to the office to find Carl, the clerk on duty. And Carl's the kind of guy who's been doing this job forever and who doesn't get rattled very easily. I told him about that kid and he checked the logbook. Now, sure enough, room 14 had been rented out the night before to a couple with a child who actually paid cash. Now, the three of us had then tried knocking on the door of room 14. Carl knocked but got no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. He gave me a nervous look, then went to get his master key. And the smell hit me before the door was even halfway open. Not the strong, rotting smell you get when something's been dead a while, more like that metallic tang of fresh blood. The room was a wreck. The bed sheets were tangled and stained, drawers had been pulled out and clothes thrown all over, and one of the lamps were knocked over and cracked. I saw flecks of blood on one of the walls, little spots like someone had flicked a paintbrush dipped in red. There was more on the bed sheets, so much that we couldn't write it off as a nosebleed or something equally harmless. Carl swore under his breath and I stepped back quickly so the kid couldn't see. I put my hands on his shoulders and turned him toward the parking lot, telling him that we were going to wait outside. I tried to keep him talking, asking about school and if he liked cartoons. He barely answered me. It was like he knew what had happened and he couldn't process it yet. The police showed up maybe 20 minutes later. The first two deputies went in to search the room, and then not long after, they were joined by another officer in plain clothes who I'm guessing was a detective. And that's when I knew that it must have been something serious, very serious. They kept asking us the same questions over and over, stuff like how we found the kid, what time it was, if we'd seen anyone come or go. And I told them everything we knew, which wasn't much. Carl told them about the cash payment and that there was no car listed on the registry. Now, once I was done with the cops, I kept trying to keep the kid distracted. I found some old crayons in the office desk and a few sheets of paper, and he sat at one of the lobby tables and drew pictures while the cops went in and out of the room. At one point, I remember looking over to see what he was drawing and saw it look like a bed with red scribbles all over it. I don't know if it was my imagination, kind of like filling in the gaps, but I felt horrible knowing that he might have seen something happen to his parents. A few guests came by to see what the commotion was, but the cops kept moving along until one lady, the lady in room 6, said that she thought that she'd heard a loud bang in the middle of the night. It had been loud enough to wake her, but since it only happened the one time, she'd figured it was just someone dropping a heavy suitcase or maybe her hearing something. Only then did she realize that she might well have heard something terrible actually happening. It was maybe 2 hours before a woman from Child Protective Services stopped by to see about the kid. She was polite but firm with us, but super sweet and friendly with the kid as she told him that he needed to go with her to talk to some nice folks over at her office. He didn't ask questions. He just took her hand and followed her to her car. I don't know why, but I knew right then that whatever happened in that room, he wasn't going to see his parents ever again. The police never told us much after that. They took the sheets and the lamp and some clothing and a few other things from the room, and it was sealed for a while, and when I finally got it back to clean, it was completely stripped bare. The mattress was gone, the curtains were gone, almost everything had been taken away to be examined as evidence. They left a faint outline on the carpet where the bed used to be, and even though I scrubbed for hours, I could still see a shadow of that reddish-brown stain on the wall. Every now and then I wonder about that kid, if he remembers that day, if he ever found out what happened. I've cleaned plenty of bad messes in my time, rooms full of garbage, rooms where people overdosed, heck, even rooms where people have died. But there was something different about room 14. Something about the quiet way that boy paced outside like he already knew that he was alone. I still work here and not much has changed. The paint on the doors is even more faded and the ice machine still doesn't work half the time. But I can't walk past that room without glancing at the door. I half expect to see a small figure waiting there pacing back and forth not knowing, or maybe knowing too well, why Mom and Dad are gone forever. For under 5 years, I used to work the front desk at a little motel in the middle of nowhere. It was a quiet little place, a little run down, but Rhonda, our cleaner, kept the place sparkling. We used to get hunters in the fall, fishermen in the summer, and the occasional trucker rolling in during the midnight hours. And as much as it was mostly a boring job, I came to appreciate the safety and stability. But every so often, we got some real bad men rolling into that old parking lot of ours, and one of them came in the spring of 1996. It was late on a Sunday evening when his car turned into the lot. It had been a quiet day, maybe 4 or 5 check-ins, and I was halfway through a bad cup of coffee when he walked up to the front desk. He looked normal, a regular middle-aged white guy with a big coat and a red woolly hat. He was friendly too and greeted me warmly before saying he wanted a room for the night. I checked which rooms were free, told him the rate, and then after he slid a credit card across the counter, I ran it through, but the machine declined it. And he says, "Huh? That's weird. It's been working fine all day," and then asked me to try the card again. I did not once, but twice, and both times the card was declined. The guy seemed really embarrassed. He pulled out his wallet as he apologized a bunch, and I told him it was fine as he handed me the cash. Those things happen from time to time, and he didn't have anything to apologize for. He gave me this big smile as he thanked me, and then after I handed him his key and directed him to room 6, he thanked me and headed off down the hall. I was working the night shift that night, 9 p.m. to 7 a.m., so aside from watching the place and making sure the vending machine was all stocked up, all I did was watch movies on the little box TV that we kept in the office. I could keep an eye on the parking lot, so if guests rolled in, I could see them coming. But that night, when I saw headlights coming into the lot, I looked up to see not just one, but 2 cruisers from the Mason County Sheriff's Department. 2 deputies stayed outside, watching all the rooms, but one deputy came inside to ask me about a declined credit card a few hours earlier. He knew it had been declined 3 times, and he needed to speak to the person using it. When I mentioned the guy in the red hat, the deputy asked which room he was in, and I led him to the room. The door was locked, but I gave them the spare key. They opened it slowly, and their guns were drawn, but the room was empty. The man in the red hat was gone. One of the deputies said that he must have been watching the parking lot, and when he saw the patrol cars drive by, he slipped out through his room's rear window. He left behind nothing but a half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand, a pair of muddy boots by the bed, and the faint smell of something that I couldn't place right away, almost like hair dye or some type of chemical. The deputies asked me to stay out of the room until another group of cops had searched the place and taken away evidence. But then a few hours later, I was taking out some trash when I overheard 2 of the deputies talking to each other, and what I heard made my skin crawl. They said the forensics guy had found a bag in that room and that inside were a whole bunch of different wigs. The forensics team said that they'd need to test it to confirm it, but that at first glance, it looked and felt a hell of a lot like real human hair. But it wasn't that which got me. It was hearing one of the deputies say how one of the wigs matched the hair of a missing woman who disappeared only a week or so earlier. And I decided that I didn't want to hear any more. The deputies and forensics folks stayed for a couple of hours. They took the wigs and the boots and even the water bottle. I heard one of them say that they were going to check it for DNA, and when they left, the motel went quiet again, but it felt like anything but peaceful. Just hours before, someone who may or may not have been a psychopath, trophy-seeking murderer had been standing 3 feet from me. I'd handed him a key, smiled at him, and I even told him to have a good night. And all the while, maybe in that bag that he was carrying, there was some missing woman's hair. That thought will stay with me as long as I live, and you should have seen how calm he was too. You'd never have suspected in a million years that he was capable of something like that. No visible nerves, no rush, just sort of still, like he had all the time in the world. And I didn't hear much beyond that. The sheriff came back a few days later to ask me some more questions, but they hadn't caught the guy, and he couldn't say if the hair really did belong to that missing woman, but I could tell by the way he talked that it was probably bad. After that, every time someone walked through that door to check in, I watched them a little differently. I still think about that man, a whole lot actually, because I know people like him don't just exist in movies or the news now. They walk through the front door with a big old smile on their face, pretending there's someone they're not. And you've got no way of knowing who they really are until it's too late. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Go check it out. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, you shall squeak when spoken to.